Welcome to the last of my Christmas readings. I'm Trudy Morgan Cole, and for the last few days I've been reading selections from my Newfoundland historical novels, scenes that are set at or around Christmas. And today my dog Gal is joining me. I think you can see her in the picture there. And I'm going to read a sneak peek from Book 3 of the Cupids Trilogy. I'm not going to tell you too much about the book because I know people don't like to be spoiled. If you don't want to know anything about it, then don't watch this video. But if you're okay with a little sneak peek, this is a scene that is set at Christmas 1617 in a little community that was then called either Musqueto or Mosquito Cove. Later it was known as just Mosquito, and later still, about 300 years later, they changed the name to Bristol's Hope, which is what it's known as today. And this scene has all of our three main characters from the trilogy, Ned, Nancy, and Catherine, who are all in Bristol's Hope at the moment, as well as the other residents, the other families who make their home in that tiny, I don't know if you could even call it a community at this point, but that tiny settlement, including a man named Tisquantum, who some of you may have heard or read me talking about before, also known to history as Squanto. He was a Wampanoag indigenous man who had been kidnapped, taken to Europe, found his way to England and then to Newfoundland, where he spent a little time before eventually returning to his home. And so Tisquantum is also present for this Christmas scene, and he's the first person who speaks. "Is it the English custom to bring boughs of trees into the house?" Tisquantum asked, as he and Ned carried armloads of spruce and pine branches to the house. The women had declared they wanted some to deck the mantel and windowsills. Ned shrugged. "'Twasn't done when I was a child in Bristol, not in my house nor in my master's house, any rate. I think some of the wealthy folk, merchants and the like, would put holly or mistletoe about." 8 men, 4 women, and 5 small children were living on Nicholas Guy's plantation as the Christmas season drew near. Ned was reminded of that first Christmas at Cupid's Cove 7 years ago, when he and the rest of John Guy's men had all lived in the one big dwelling house and tried to make what cheer they could. A man had hanged himself between Christmas and New Year's, and Ned thought that went a long way towards saying how successful they had been at making the season merry. This holiday could not help but be an improvement. Holly! It was this plant that Sir John's servants would put about his house. I was with them at Christmas last year, Tisquantum said. My people do something the same with some of our Thanksgivings, using the plants of each season to make all beautiful for our celebrations. And do you celebrate anything at this time of year, in midwinter? After the moon of hunting, it is the moon of storytelling. Like you, we stay warm by the fire and tell tales in winter. We have rituals for all the turnings of the year. I think perhaps all people do. But this Christmas is to do with your God, yes? Yes, when the Lord Jesus Christ was born on earth, Ned said. He knew that Tisquantum had been instructed in the basics of the Christian faith, but unlike the Powhatan women that Nancy had known in Virginia, Tisquantum had not been baptized or taken a Christian name. He was curious about what the English believed and practiced, but his was the curiosity of a traveler, intrigued by the customs of the strange lands he visited. He was, after all, a traveler, though not by his own choosing. Ah, yes, gods, always being born, always dying, over and over, Tisquantum said, a comment that reminded Ned that the world was much larger and stranger than he had imagined it when he was growing up in Bristol. Nicholas Guy had, at Ned's suggestion, invited the Wampanoag man to spend the winter on their plantation here at Mosqueto Cove. Governor Mason's plan to have him act as a translator with the native people had been foiled, for now at least, and Tisquantum's own plan to find a ship that would carry him to his own country could not happen until spring at the earliest. He gladly accepted the offer to remain at Mosqueto. On the day before Christmas Eve, the kitchen of the big house, always a busy place, was a hive of activity. Mistress Catherine, Daisy, and Bess were all chopping and mixing bowls full of ingredients for the pies and puddings that would grace the table on Christmas Day. Nancy was not there. She was at Bess's house with the children. Lately the women had developed a pattern on busy days. One of them would take all 5 children down to Bess and Frank's little house and care for them there, so they would not be constantly underfoot in the kitchen. "Where will we lay these?" Tisquantum asked. He stood behind Daisy, who was working with her back to the door, and she gave a nervous little jump as he spoke. Ned had noticed that of all the women, Daisy seemed the most uncomfortable about having an Indian living among them, and she rarely spoke directly to Tisquantum. But now she turned, gestured to his armful of boughs, and said, Leave them on the bench. We'll decide where to put them about when we deck the hall later today. Tisquantum did so, then took out a twist of cloth he had carried in his pocket. Inside it lay a few handfuls of hard red berries. "I found these," he said, showing them to Daisy. "Not to eat, but they will look well if you place them among the branches, to make them bright." "Ooh, lovely," said Daisy. Catherine Guy gave the two men a beaming smile. "Thank you so much. I know it is a trivial thing when you are all so busy, but I'd like to put out a few fair things for the season, to remind us that it is a joyful time." "Truth be told, we're not so busy at the moment," Ned said. "There's more men on the place than there is work to be done now that the snow is down. Mending nets, cutting firewood, and making furniture are all the chores left for the men to do." "Well, the women's work never ends," Catherine said. "Odd, is not how men's work goes by seasons, but except for tending the garden, women's work is much the same all year round. People must eat, clothes must be made and mended, no matter the time of year." The big room was warm and inviting, the fire crackling in the hearth and the air filled with the scents of food. Ned was in no hurry to go back out in the chilly morning and cut more firewood, and was glad when Daisy handed a plate of small spiced pastries, first to him and then, after a brief hesitation, to Tisquantum. "We're trying to save all the good things for the feast," Catherine said, "but you were good enough to bring in the boughs, so you both earned a tart. I made them from the dried figs we got off a Portuguese ship in the autumn." After leaving the big house, Ned parted ways with Tisquantum, who was going back to help with more wood cutting out behind the barn. Ned took the path that led farther along the shore to where Frank Tipton was outside chopping wood. "I'll give you a hand with that," Ned said, "after I step inside and say hello to my wife, for I've not seen her since before dawn this morning." He pushed open the door and entered a room that was a miniature of the one he had just left. A hearth fire, a table with benches on either side, but everything smaller and more modest than in the Guy's house. Instead of the busy hum of women at work, this room was clamorous with the voices of 4 small boys, ranging in age from Jemmy, who was just a year old, up to Jonathan, who was nearly 5. All 4 were engaged in their seemingly endless pursuit of making wooden block towers, knocking down wooden block towers, and arguing over who had knocked down whose tower. Beside the hearth sat Nancy with little Alice by her side. Alice rocked back and forth with a cloth poppet in her arms, singing a tuneless lullaby, and Ned thought how much gentler little girls were than little boys. Nancy met his eyes as he came through the door and was about to speak, when Alice took the poppet she was gently cradling and hurled it into one of the block towers, as if firing a catapult at the walls of a besieged city. The boys screamed, Alice sat down looking pleased with herself, and Ned revised his thoughts about the gentleness of little girls. Nancy raised her hands in mock surrender and rose to meet him, picking her way through the tangle of small bodies on the floor. "I ought to chide them and punish them for fighting, but truly, if I did that, I would never stop. Bess and Catherine are as close to sainthood as the Blessed Virgin Mary herself." "More, perhaps, since Jesus was never naughty," Ned pointed out. He bent down to pick up the child who was squalling the loudest. It was Bess's younger lad, Matt, and said very gravely, "Do you see how people don't like it when you knock down the towers they've made? It's not very good, is it?" To Nancy he added, "It might be easier just to whip the lot of them." "I shall leave that to their parents. When I deliver them back to the house, I'll simply announce that everyone needs a good whipping, and that will be that." They both laughed, and the children, responding to their laughter, settled down and began rebuilding the fallen towers, this time with Alice joining in to rebuild what she had destroyed. "After dinner, Bess is coming down to watch them, and I'll be free to begin cleaning and dressing the pig for Christmas dinner," Nancy said. "Butchering a pig will seem almost like a holiday in itself after this lot," Ned said, pulling her toward him for a quick kiss. The true holiday, when it came, was everything the women had worked so hard to make it. On Christmas morning they all crowded into the main room of the Guy's house, while Nicholas Guy read the service from the prayer book. It was his custom to do this with his household every Sunday morning, as they were far from any church or minister, but there was a special solemnity to this gathering on Christmas morning. Tisquantum, who normally absented himself from the Sunday prayers, sat with them now, and Ned saw Daisy glancing at him often, as if she were still trying to figure out how this heathen man fit into their Christian festival. Ned laced his fingers through Nancy as the words of the service spun and unrolled all around them. After the prayers, the women brought out the feast, the roast pork, the savory pies, the breads and cakes and tarts. Wine and brandy joined the ale on the table, and soon there were songs, first sacred carols, then merrier tunes of celebration, as the eating ended and the drinking began. Many of the adults, not only the children's parents, had spent hours making small gifts for the little ones, and these were now handed around with great excitement. There were more carved wooden horses and soldiers than the children knew what to do with. Children, Ned thought, who had never seen either a horse or a soldier in their lives. Tisquantum's gift was perhaps more apt, for he had carved 5 little wooden boats, one for each child. They all understood boats. "You can sail them on the pond in spring," Nicholas Guy said. But spring was an eternity away, so Catherine filled a shallow basin with a little water so the tiny fleet could set sail. Bess kept a careful watch to make sure the sailors, in their enthusiasm, did not upset the sea and flood the floor. The women had somehow found time for more knitting and sewing, another poppet for Alice, and cloth dogs and horses for the boys, as well as practical gifts for both children and adults. Patchwork quilts and rag rugs made from old clothes, and warm knitted sweaters, gloves, and caps and scarves for the cold months ahead. Rafe had carved 3 wooden whistles, and one after another the men picked them up to try and play along with Frank's fiddle tunes, with varying degrees of success. "I've a gift for you," Ned said to Nancy, "but 'tis not here. I will show you later." "And I have one for you," she said. And that's as far as I'll read. If you want to find out what the rest of their Christmas gifts were, or indeed what else happens in this story, you can get this book when it comes out from Breakwater Books in fall of 2023, in plenty of time for next Christmas. In the meantime, I hope you and all those you love have a wonderful and peaceful holiday season and a Happy New Year.